The internet thought Emma Carter had the perfect family. Every photo showed glowing smiles, expensive vacations, candlelit dinners, and captions about gratitude and love. Thousands of people followed her mother online, leaving comments like "Goals perfect family" and "Your daughter is so lucky." But behind those polished pictures was a house so emotionally cold that Emma sometimes wondered if anyone inside it could actually see her at all. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people, leave a comment below. Sometimes knowing someone else understands can make a difference. From the outside, the Carter family looked untouchable. Their white two-story house stood at the end of a quiet street, lined with trees and trimmed hedges. A luxury SUV sat in the driveway. The lawn was always perfect, and every holiday decoration appeared exactly on time, like something copied from a magazine cover. Emma's mother loved appearances more than anything. She spent hours planning photos, arranging flowers, adjusting lighting, and practicing smiles before posting another beautiful family moment online. In those photos, Emma always stood slightly behind her parents, smiling softly, while her mother wrapped an arm around her just long enough for the camera. The second the picture ended, the warmth disappeared. Her mother would immediately check the comments while Emma quietly walked away unnoticed. Her father was different, but not better. He wasn't loud or cruel. He simply existed like a shadow moving through the house. He left early for work, returned late, ate dinner in silence, and rarely asked Emma anything deeper than how was school. Even when she answered, it never felt like he was truly listening. Conversations in that house were never about feelings. They were about appearances, schedules, business dinners, and social media engagement. Emma learned very early that emotions were inconvenient. If she cried, her mother sighed heavily and accused her of being dramatic. If she wanted attention, her mother reminded her how busy adults were. Slowly, Emma stopped asking for comfort altogether. She became the easy child, the quiet daughter, who stayed in her room, handled her own problems, and never interrupted her parents' carefully curated lives. At school, people envied her. Classmates talked about her family trips and expensive clothes. Teachers complimented how independent and mature she seemed. Nobody realized independence had not been a gift. It had been survival. Emma woke herself up every morning, prepared her own breakfast, packed her own school bag, and learned how to stay invisible inside her own home. Sometimes she would sit downstairs late at night, listening to her parents laugh together while planning another luxury vacation. She wanted to walk into the room and join them, but something inside her always stopped her. It felt like there was an invisible wall separating her from the warmth everyone else seemed allowed to touch. The hardest part wasn't the silence. It was pretending the silence didn't hurt. One evening, Emma overheard her mother talking on the phone while editing vacation photos. "People would kill for this life," she laughed proudly. Emma stood quietly in the hallway, holding a school paper she wanted to show someone. She had received one of the highest grades in class, but after hearing those words, she slowly lowered the paper and returned upstairs without saying anything. Deep down, she had already started believing her feelings simply mattered less than maintaining the illusion of perfection. And inside that beautiful house filled with expensive furniture and glowing screens, Emma slowly learned one heartbreaking truth. You can live surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. If this part of Emma's story touched you, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. Sometimes sharing even a small thought reminds someone else they're not alone either. Some children learn how to read early. Others learn how to stay quiet so nobody gets annoyed with them. Emma Carter didn't remember the exact moment she became invisible in her own home. It happened slowly, so slowly, that at first it almost felt normal. If you've ever been the easy one in the family, the person who never wanted to cause trouble, this part of the story might feel painfully familiar. And if stories like this speak to you, subscribing is a simple way to stay connected to more journeys about healing, survival, and finding your voice again. Emma learned very early that attention in her house came with a price. Whenever her mother was stressed from filming videos or planning events, even the smallest interruption could change the mood instantly. One afternoon, Emma accidentally spilled juice on the kitchen counter while trying to pour herself a drink. It wasn't a disaster. The liquid barely reached the edge before she grabbed paper towels to clean it up. But the second her mother saw it, she let out that same heavy sigh Emma knew too well. "Can you please stop making things harder for me?" she muttered, without even looking directly at her. The words weren't shouted, but somehow that made them hurt more. Emma stood there frozen, clutching the wet paper towels, while guilt spread through her chest over something so small. After moments like that, she started training herself to need less. Less help, less comfort, less attention. By the time other kids were still asking parents to help with homework or bedtime routines, Emma was already handling most things alone. She woke herself up every morning before sunrise because nobody else checked if she was late. She learned how to make simple breakfasts quietly without banging cabinets or making noise that might irritate her mother. She memorized where every cleaning supply was stored because cleaning mistakes quickly before anyone noticed became second nature. At school, teachers praised how mature and independent she seemed. "You're so responsible," they would say proudly. Emma always smiled politely when she heard it, but deep inside those compliments felt strange. Responsibility had never been a choice for her. It had been survival disguised as maturity. Some evenings, Emma would sit alone at the dining table finishing homework, while her parents laughed together in the living room, planning sponsored trips and expensive collaborations. She could hear every word from where she sat, but it felt like listening to strangers through a wall. Sometimes she wanted to walk in and tell them about her day, or ask if they could spend time together, but experience had already taught her what usually happened. Her mother would glance up distractedly while scrolling through comments online. Her father would nod without really hearing her. Then the conversation would return to flights, cameras, and followers, so eventually Emma stopped trying. Silence became safer than disappointment. One winter evening, Emma developed a high fever while both parents attended a social event across town. She texted her mother several times saying she didn't feel well. Hours passed before a response finally appeared. "Take medicine and go to sleep. We'll be home late." Emma remembered staring at the message through blurry eyes while wrapped in blankets on the couch. What hurt most wasn't being sick. It was realizing nobody was coming to check on her. That night changed something inside her permanently. After that, she stopped believing comfort was something she deserved automatically. She started believing love had to be earned by being convenient, quiet, and low maintenance. Over time, Emma became extremely good at pretending everything was fine. She smiled in family photos, kept her grades high, and never complained loudly enough for outsiders to notice anything wrong. But inside, loneliness grew quietly, like a shadow, following her everywhere. The saddest part was that nobody in her family seemed cruel on the surface. There were no screaming fights, no obvious violence, no dramatic scenes people would immediately recognize as harmful. There was only emotional absence, repeated so often that it slowly shaped the way Emma saw herself. She began to believe her feelings were burdens instead of signals that she needed care. And without realizing it, she carried that belief into every part of her life. If you're listening right now, and any part of Emma's story reminds you of your own experiences, I hope you remember this: needing love does not make you difficult. And if you'd like to follow more stories about resilience and healing, feel free to subscribe and stay a while. Sometimes hearing someone else's story helps us understand our own a little better. The day my parents left me behind, my mother smiled for a photo before she even said goodbye. Emma Carter would replay that moment in her head for years afterward, not because it was dramatic or loud, but because of how ordinary it felt to everyone except her. If emotional stories like this stay with you, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and it lets more people discover stories that remind them they're not alone. The announcement came during dinner. Though dinner in the Carter house usually meant everyone sitting together while barely speaking, Emma was quietly eating pasta when her mother suddenly placed her phone down with unusual excitement sparkling in her eyes. "Big news," she announced brightly. "We got invited to join a luxury travel campaign across Europe." Her father nodded proudly while scrolling through flight information on his tablet. 3 weeks, he added casually. Paris, Rome, Santorini, and a few other places. Emma looked up from her plate, waiting for the part where they explained what would happen to her. At first, she assumed maybe she would stay with relatives or family friends. Surely someone had already been arranged to look after her. But then her mother smiled and waved a dismissive hand. "You'll stay here, obviously. You're mature enough to handle it." Emma blinked in confusion. Alone. The room went quiet for half a second before her mother laughed softly, like the question itself sounded childish. "Don't be dramatic," she replied. "We'll call every few days." Emma stared down at her plate as her stomach tightened. Something deep inside her whispered that this wasn't normal, but years of emotional neglect had already trained her to doubt her own reactions. Her father barely looked up as he added, "There's food in the pantry. You'll be fine." Then the conversation immediately shifted back to hotel reservations, sponsorship deals, and filming schedules, as though the decision had already been finalized long before Emma even entered the room. Over the next week, the house transformed into chaos. Expensive luggage lined the hallway, while packages arrived daily with designer outfits and travel accessories. Emma watched her mother rehearse cheerful introductions for videos in front of mirrors, while her father argued with airlines about upgraded seating. Nobody asked Emma how she felt about being left behind. Nobody explained emergency plans or checked whether she felt scared. It was simply assumed she would adapt quietly, like she always did. One afternoon, Emma finally gathered enough courage to ask again. "What if something happens while you're gone?" Her mother didn't even pause while folding clothes into a suitcase. "Nothing's going to happen. But what if it does?" This time her mother sighed impatiently. "Emma, people your age babysit children and have part-time jobs. You'll survive 3 weeks in a nice house." The words settled heavily inside her chest, not because they sounded cruel, but because they made Emma feel foolish for being worried at all. Slowly, she began convincing herself maybe she was overreacting. Maybe loneliness was just another thing she was supposed to handle quietly. The night before the trip, Emma walked through the kitchen counting supplies. A few boxes of cereal, instant noodles, bread that would probably expire before they returned. Her mother handed her some cash without looking directly at her. "This should be enough if you need anything." Then she returned to editing travel content on her laptop. Emma held the money awkwardly in her hands, wanting to ask for reassurance more than anything else. She wanted someone to say, "We'll miss you," or call anytime if you're scared. But those words never came. The next morning, the family posed for photos in the driveway beside stacked luggage, while sunlight reflected perfectly off the luxury SUV. Emma forced herself to smile as her mother wrapped an arm around her shoulders for the camera. "Family adventure begins," her mother announced cheerfully into the phone screen. Seconds later, the recording stopped. The smile vanished instantly. "Lock the doors at night," her father muttered while loading bags into the car. Then just like that, they drove away. Emma stood alone in the silent driveway, long after the car disappeared around the corner. The house behind her suddenly felt enormous and unfamiliar. For the first time in her life, the loneliness she'd always carried quietly inside herself no longer felt emotional. It felt physical, real, heavy enough to fill every empty room around her. And deep down, Emma realized something terrifying. Nobody had looked back to see if she was okay. If this chapter of Emma's journey moved you, leaving a like or subscribing is a small but meaningful way to support more stories about resilience, healing, and finding hope, even in difficult places. The first night alone, Emma Carter slept with every light in the house turned on. The silence after her parents left didn't feel peaceful. It felt enormous, like the walls themselves suddenly understood she had been abandoned there. If you've ever had a moment where a house stopped feeling like home, this chapter may hit close to the heart. And if any part of Emma's story feels familiar, you're always welcome to share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes strangers understand each other more deeply than the people sitting in the same room. After the Carter family's SUV disappeared down the street, Emma stayed frozen in the driveway longer than she realized. The afternoon air felt strangely cold, despite the sunlight. Eventually, she walked back inside and locked the front door carefully, as if doing everything correctly might somehow stop the growing panic in her chest. The house immediately felt different without her parents there. During normal days, the silence in the Carter home had always existed quietly in the background beneath phone calls, television noise, or the clicking of laptop keys. But now there was nothing. No footsteps upstairs, no voices drifting through the hallway, no movement at all. Emma wandered from room to room, almost aimlessly, that first evening. Trying to distract herself, she straightened pillows. Nobody used folded blankets, already folded neatly, and checked locks multiple times even before sunset. Every little sound startled her. The refrigerator humming, pipes shifting inside the walls, branches brushing against windows outside. She kept telling herself she was mature enough to handle this, repeating her mother's words, almost like instructions programmed into her brain. but deep down fear was already creeping in. That night, Emma microwaved instant noodles for dinner and sat alone at the massive dining table designed for 8 people. The chandelier above her reflected softly against polished silverware, while she ate from a cheap paper bowl. The contrast almost made her laugh. The house looked luxurious enough for magazine covers, yet somehow it felt emptier than ever. She turned on the television just for noise, but every commercial showing smiling families made the loneliness worse. Eventually, she carried her food upstairs and ate sitting on the floor beside her bed instead. Sleeping became nearly impossible. Emma left lights glowing in the hallway, bathroom, and kitchen because darkness suddenly felt threatening in a way she couldn't explain. Around midnight, she heard a loud noise outside, and her entire body froze. Her mind immediately imagined intruders, emergencies, disasters. Trembling, she peeked through the curtains only to realize a trash bin had tipped over in the wind. Even after understanding that her heartbeat refused to slow down for a long time. Over the next several days, Emma settled into a strange routine. Every morning she checked her phone, hoping for messages from her parents. Most days there were only brief texts attached to smiling vacation photos. "Look at this view," her mother sent beneath a picture of the Eiffel Tower sparkling at night. Another message arrived later showing a beach in Greece with the caption, "Wish you were here." Emma stared at the screen, wondering how someone could say those words without realizing how painful they sounded. Meanwhile, her own world kept shrinking smaller. She began eating less each day to make groceries last longer. Instead of using fresh food quickly, she saved it for later, and survived mostly on cereal, crackers, and instant noodles. She avoided turning on too many lights at night, because she worried about electricity bills, even though her parents had never mentioned money. Anxiety made her think constantly about becoming a burden somehow. At school, Emma pretended everything was normal. She smiled when classmates asked about her parents' glamorous European trip. She nodded politely, while teachers praised how independent she seemed. Nobody noticed the exhaustion beneath her eyes, or the way she hesitated before going home each afternoon. Time. It felt like a giant empty building waiting silently for something bad to happen. One rainy evening, Emma accidentally dropped a glass in the kitchen. The sound shattered through the house so violently that she burst into tears immediately after. Not because of the broken glass itself, but because there was nobody else there. Nobody to say it's okay. Nobody to help clean up. Nobody to remind her she wasn't alone. She knelt on the kitchen floor, shaking while rain hammered against the windows outside, and for the first time since her parents left, Emma allowed herself to admit the truth. She had been trying desperately to ignore. She was scared. Truly scared. And the worst part was realizing nobody had even asked whether she could handle this before deciding she should. If Emma's story touched you, feel free to leave a comment sharing where you're listening from, or what part stayed with you most. Sometimes a single kind message can mean more than we realize. By the time Emma Carter finally called her mother crying, she had already spent days pretending she wasn't hungry. At first, Emma kept convincing herself things would get better. She told herself her parents would check in more often soon, that maybe they were just busy adjusting to the trip. But as the days passed, the kitchen slowly emptied, while the silence inside the house grew heavier. Every morning she opened cabinets, hoping she had overlooked something. Every night she carefully calculated how much food remained and how long she could stretch it. The fresh groceries had disappeared first. Then the cereal boxes became lighter and lighter until only crumbs remained at the bottom. Even the instant noodles that once seemed endless were almost gone. Emma began drinking extra water, just to quiet the ache in her stomach. She told herself it wasn't that serious. Plenty of people skipped meals sometimes. But deep down, fear had already started settling inside her like cold stone. One afternoon after school, Emma stood in the grocery store, holding a basket with bread, canned soup, and peanut butter. Nothing expensive, just enough to survive another week. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached the register and pulled out the emergency credit card her mother had left behind. The cashier swiped it once, frowned, then tried again. "Declined," he said flatly. Emma felt heat rush into her face. "Could you try one more time?" she whispered. The cashier sighed and swiped again before shaking his head. Still declined. People in line behind her shifted impatiently, while Emma stared at the card in disbelief. Her mother had promised it would work if she needed anything important. Embarrassed and panicking, Emma quietly asked the cashier to remove several items from the order. Then more again until only a loaf of cheap bread remained. She paid with the last few dollars from her pocket and walked home carrying a single plastic bag that felt far too light. That night, hunger finally pushed her to call her mother directly, instead of sending texts. The phone rang several times before connecting. Loud music and laughter exploded through the speaker immediately. Emma, her mother, answered distractedly. "Can this wait? We're at dinner with sponsors." Emma swallowed hard. "The card doesn't work." "What card?" "The emergency card you left me." Her mother groaned softly, like the conversation itself was exhausting. "Then use cash." "I almost don't have any left." There was a pause, but not the kind Emma hoped for. Not concern, not alarm, just irritation. "Emma, we already gave you money." "I know, but food is running out." Her mother let out a sharp breath. "You need to stop acting helpless all the time." The words hit harder than Emma expected. She gripped the phone tighter while trying not to cry. "I'm not acting helpless," she whispered. Before she could finish, voices interrupted loudly in the background. Someone was calling her mother over for photos. "Listen," her mother snapped impatiently. "I cannot deal with this right now. Eat something from the pantry and stop making everything dramatic." Then the line went dead. Emma sat frozen on the kitchen floor, staring at her phone long after the call ended. Around her, the pantry shelves stood nearly empty. One can of soup. Half a sleeve of crackers. Rice she didn't fully know how to cook properly. For the first time since her parents left, something inside her finally cracked. Until then, Emma had still clung to a tiny hope that maybe they cared more than they showed. Maybe underneath the distraction and emotional distance, there was still love waiting to appear if things became serious enough. But hearing her mother sound annoyed, instead of worried, shattered that illusion completely. Emma slowly lowered the phone into her lap, while tears slipped silently down her face. What hurt most wasn't the hunger anymore. It was realizing that asking for help had somehow made her feel guilty instead of protected. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows while vacation photos from her mother's social media continued appearing online. Smiling faces. Fancy restaurants. Ocean sunsets, glowing gold, beneath captions about gratitude and happiness. Meanwhile, Emma sat alone in a silent kitchen eating dry bread for dinner, trying to ignore the painful emptiness twisting inside both her stomach and her heart. And somewhere deep inside herself, she began wondering a question. No child should ever have to ask if the people who are supposed to love you most treat your pain like an inconvenience. What does that say about your worth? The video started with a shaking camera, an empty refrigerator, and a whisper, "I don't know what to do anymore." Emma Carter never planned to document her life. At first, recording those videos felt embarrassing, almost dramatic, like something she would later delete out of shame. But after the phone call with her mother, something inside her changed. The loneliness had become too heavy to carry silently. And for the first time, Emma wanted proof that what was happening to her was real. Not because she wanted attention, but because deep down she feared that if nobody saw it, maybe someday she would convince herself it hadn't been that bad after all. The first recording happened late at night in the kitchen. Emma sat on the cold floor, with her phone balanced against a cereal box, while dim light from the stove illuminated her tired face. For several seconds, she said nothing at all. She simply stared at the screen as though trying to gather courage to speak honestly for the first time in her life. Finally, she whispered, "My parents left for Europe almost 2 weeks ago." Her voice sounded smaller than she expected. "They said I could handle everything alone." Then she slowly turned the camera toward the nearly empty refrigerator. Half a bottle of juice. Expired yogurt. A few slices of bread already beginning to harden. The pantry looked even worse. Emma opened cabinets one by one, while the camera captured shelves growing emptier each day. She didn't cry in that first video. Somehow, the exhaustion had gone beyond tears. She simply talked quietly into the phone as if she were speaking to someone who might eventually understand. "I tried not to eat too much," she admitted softly. "I thought maybe I could make it last longer." After finishing the recording, Emma watched it back immediately. Seeing herself on screen startled her. She looked thinner than she realized, pale, tired, Her eyes carried a kind of sadness she normally avoided, looking at directly in mirrors. For a moment she almost deleted the video out of embarrassment, but instead she saved it into a hidden folder on her phone. The next day she recorded another clip after coming home from school. This time the camera showed the untouched dining room table, while Emma ate dry crackers alone beside the kitchen counter. "My mom posted pictures from Greece today," she said quietly. "Everyone in the comments keeps calling us the perfect family." A bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it. That laugh scared her more than crying would have. Over the following days, the videos became almost like diary entries. Emma recorded the rain hitting the windows during sleepless nights. She filmed herself wrapping blankets tightly around her shoulders, because the house felt too big and empty. She whispered fears into the darkness she could never say aloud to anyone else. Sometimes she talked about hunger, sometimes about loneliness, sometimes about how guilty she felt for even being upset at all. "Maybe I'm overreacting," she admitted in one video, while rubbing tired eyes. "Maybe normal families are just different now." But even as she said the words, her voice cracked with doubt. The recordings slowly became the only place where Emma stopped pretending. At school she still smiled politely. She still told classmates her parents were traveling for work. She still acted calm and mature. But inside those videos, the truth existed unfiltered for the first time. One evening after another ignored message from her mother, Emma pointed the camera directly at herself and finally asked the question haunting her for days. "If they loved me, wouldn't they want to know if I'm okay?" The silence afterward felt unbearable. She reached forward and stopped recording quickly, but not before tears finally rolled down her face. That particular video became the one she watched repeatedly late at night. Not because she enjoyed reliving the pain, but because it reminded her that her feelings were real. The fear was real, the neglect was real, and maybe most importantly she was real too. Deep inside, Emma had spent years feeling invisible in her own home. But these videos captured something undeniable, a frightened girl trying desperately to survive, while the people meant to protect her looked away. Without realizing it yet, Emma was creating evidence that would eventually change everything. If you've stayed with Emma's story this far, subscribing helps support more emotional journeys like this one. Sometimes stories about survival remind us how important kindness truly is, especially the kind we give to people who quietly need it most. Sometimes the people who save us are the ones who simply notice we're not okay. Emma Carter had spent so long making herself invisible that she never expected anyone outside her family to see through the act. At school, she still smiled politely. In public, she still said her parents were traveling for work. She kept her shoulders straight, answered questions calmly, and pretended everything was under control. But loneliness leaves traces even when someone tries desperately to hide them. And eventually, one person finally noticed. If you're still listening to Emma's story, comment the number 6 below. It quietly lets me know you're here with her through every difficult chapter. The woman who first saw the cracks was Mrs. Alvarez, an older neighbor who lived across the street from the Carter family. She wasn't loud or intrusive like some neighbors. Most days she simply watered flowers on her porch, waved politely, and kept to herself. Emma had spoken to her only a few times, before usually quick greetings while collecting mail or leaving for school. But Mrs. Alvarez noticed things other people ignored. She noticed that Emma's parents had been gone much longer than usual. She noticed the lights in the house stayed on deep into the night. And most importantly, she noticed Emma herself beginning to change. One cold evening, Emma returned home from school, carrying a backpack that looked almost heavier than she was. Rain soaked through her hoodie while she fumbled tiredly for her house key. Before she could unlock the door, Mrs. Alvarez called gently from across the street. Emma froze, slightly forcing a polite smile. "Hi." The older woman studied her quietly for a moment. "Have you eaten dinner yet?" Such a simple question. Yet the moment Emma heard it, something painful tightened in her chest. Because nobody had asked her that in days. She immediately nodded out of instinct. "Yeah, I'm fine." Mrs. Alvarez didn't move. "Are you sure?" The kindness in her voice almost broke Emma instantly. She looked away quickly, pretending to search through her backpack while fighting the sudden sting behind her eyes. "I'm just tired," she whispered. For a second, Mrs. Alvarez seemed to understand more than Emma had actually said. Well, she replied softly. I made too much soup tonight. You'd be helping me by taking some. Emma nearly refused automatically. Years of emotional neglect had taught her not to inconvenience people. But then her stomach betrayed her with a quiet growl. She prayed the woman hadn't heard. Mrs. Alvarez smiled, gently, like she understood, without embarrassment. Come inside for a few minutes, she said. No one should eat alone on a rainy night. The warmth inside the small house hit Emma immediately. The scent of homemade soup filled the kitchen while soft music played somewhere in the background. Family photos lined the walls, not perfect photos meant for social media. Real ones. Messy smiles. Wrinkled clothes. Ordinary happiness. Emma sat stiffly at the kitchen table while Mrs. Alvarez placed a steaming bowl in front of her. Careful, it's hot, she warned kindly. Emma whispered, thank you, then took her first bite. The reaction was almost immediate. Hunger she'd been suppressing for days suddenly rushed forward all at once. She tried eating slowly, to stay polite, but her hands trembled slightly, with desperation. Mrs. Alvarez noticed. She noticed everything. Your parents still away? She asked carefully, after a while. Emma nodded without looking up. When are they coming back? I don't know exactly. Silence settled over the kitchen for a moment. Then Mrs. Alvarez asked quietly, and who's been taking care of you? The spoon froze halfway to Emma's mouth. No one had asked that before. Not teachers, not relatives, not even her parents themselves. The question felt so unfamiliar that for a moment Emma didn't know how to answer. I'm taking care of myself, she finally said softly. Hearing the words out loud made them sound far sadder than they had inside her head. Mrs. Alvarez's expression changed almost invisibly. Not pity, concern, real concern. And somehow that felt even more overwhelming. Emma suddenly felt tears burning behind her eyes again. She looked down quickly, embarrassed. I'm sorry, she whispered automatically. Mrs. Alvarez frowned gently. Why are you apologizing? Emma opened her mouth, but no answer came out. Because the truth was, she honestly didn't know anymore. She had spent so long apologizing for existing, for needing things, for feeling scared, that the habit had become automatic. Mrs. Alvarez slowly reached across the table and rested a warm hand over Emma's shaking fingers. Honey, she said softly, you do not have to earn kindness. Those words hit harder than anything Emma had heard in weeks. And sitting in that tiny, warm kitchen, while rain tapped softly against the windows outside, Emma felt something unfamiliar begin to crack open inside her, the terrifying possibility that maybe she deserved care after all. The moment Emma Carter realized adults were finally taking her seriously, she didn't feel relief first. She felt terrified. After weeks of surviving alone, Emma had become used to minimizing everything. Hunger became not that bad. Fear became just stress. Loneliness became something she convinced herself she deserved. So when other people finally started noticing the truth, part of her wanted help, and another part desperately wanted to hide. Because children who grow up emotionally neglected often learn one painful lesson: very early, telling the truth can feel more dangerous than suffering in silence. Mrs. Alvarez was the first adult who truly listened, but she wasn't the last. After several evenings of quietly checking on Emma, the older woman's concern deepened into alarm. Emma looked exhausted all the time now. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her clothes hung looser than before. Worst of all, she startled at every small sound, like someone constantly waiting for disaster. One morning before school, Mrs. Alvarez gently stopped Emma near the sidewalk and handed her a small paper bag filled with fruit and sandwiches. Just in case you forget lunch, she said softly. Emma accepted it with embarrassed gratitude, but the truth was, she hadn't packed lunch in days, because there was barely anything left at home. Later that afternoon, one of Emma's teachers noticed she seemed unusually pale during class. While students worked quietly on assignments, Emma's vision suddenly blurred for a few seconds. The room tilted slightly before steadying again. She gripped the edge of her desk, tightly hoping nobody had seen, but her teacher immediately walked over. Emma, are you feeling all right? I'm fine, Emma answered automatically. The response came so quickly it sounded rehearsed. Her teacher hesitated. You look very tired. Emma forced a weak smile. I just didn't sleep well. Normally adults accepted those answers and moved on. But this time something was different. Maybe it was how thin Emma looked, maybe it was the way her hands trembled slightly while gathering her books. Or maybe it was simply that enough small warning signs had finally begun connecting together. Before the school day ended, Emma was quietly asked to visit the guidance counselor's office. The moment she stepped inside and saw both the counselor and school nurse waiting, panic surged through her chest. She instantly felt trapped. "You're not in trouble," the counselor said gently, noticing Emma's fear immediately. "We just want to check on you." Emma sat stiffly in the chair, while the nurse offered her water and crackers. The simple kindness almost made her emotional again. "Mrs. Alvarez called us this morning," the counselor explained carefully. Emma's stomach dropped. "Why?" "She's worried about you." Those words alone nearly made Emma cry. "Worried about you." Such a simple sentence, yet it felt completely unfamiliar. The counselor continued, speaking softly. "Your parents have been away for quite a while, correct?" Emma nodded cautiously. "And you've been staying alone?" Silence filled the room. Emma stared down at her hands, already feeling guilty somehow. Years of emotional neglect had trained her to protect her parents, even when they hurt her. Finally, she whispered, "They said I could handle it." The counselor exchanged a concerned glance with the nurse. "Emma," she asked carefully, "do you have enough food at home?" That question shattered something inside her instantly. Tears filled Emma's eyes before she could stop them. She tried to speak calmly, but her voice broke apart anyway. "I tried to make it last," she whispered. "I didn't want to bother anyone." The room remained quiet except for Emma's uneven breathing. Nobody interrupted her this time. Nobody called her dramatic. Nobody told her she was overreacting. For the first time, adults were simply listening. Slowly, pieces of the truth began spilling out. The empty kitchen. The declined credit card. The unanswered calls. The night she slept with lights on, because she was afraid alone in the house. Emma spoke in fragments between tears, almost shocked by her own honesty. When she finally finished, the counselor leaned forward gently and said words Emma never expected to hear. "None of this is your fault." Emma lowered her head and cried harder than before, because deep down part of her had truly believed it was. By the end of the meeting, the school had contacted Child Protective Services for a welfare check. The decision terrified Emma immediately. She imagined her parents becoming furious. She imagined ruining the family image her mother cared about more than anything else. "They're going to hate me," Emma whispered shakily. But the counselor shook her head softly. "Emma, asking for help is not betrayal." Those words stayed with her long after she left the office. That evening, sitting quietly in Mrs. Alvarez's warm kitchen once again, Emma realized something life-changing. Maybe surviving alone had never been the thing she was supposed to prove. Maybe the bravest thing she could do was finally allow someone to help her. When Emma Carter's parents finally came home, they expected hugs, airport photos, and a smiling daughter waiting at the door. Instead, they found Child Protective Services sitting in their living room. The Carter family had spent weeks posting perfect sunsets, luxury hotels, and staged family memories online. To the outside world, they looked flawless, successful, loving, untouchable. But while they were busy protecting an image, reality had already begun collapsing, quietly back home. And now, for the first time, they could no longer control the story. If emotional stories like Emma's mean something to you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It truly helps more people discover stories about healing, survival, and hope. The morning Emma's parents returned, the house felt unbearably tense. Mrs. Alvarez stayed beside Emma in the kitchen, while two social workers reviewed notes quietly in the living room. Emma's stomach twisted painfully every time headlights passed outside. Part of her still hoped somehow everything could be explained calmly. Another part feared the moment the front door opened. Then finally, just after noon, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. Emma heard excited laughter before the front door even unlocked. "We're home," her mother called cheerfully. The happiness in her voice vanished almost instantly the moment she stepped inside and saw strangers sitting in the living room. Her father stopped behind her, confused. "What's going on?" One of the social workers stood calmly. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, we need to speak with you regarding concerns about your daughter being left unsupervised." Silence crashed through the house. Emma saw her mother's expression change from confusion to disbelief, then quickly into anger. "Excuse me," she snapped. "Who called you?" Emma instinctively lowered her eyes. Even now, fear rushed through her body automatically. Her father noticed immediately. "Emma," he said sharply, "what did you tell them?" The question hit her like a slap. Not "Are you okay?" Not what happened, only concern about what had been exposed. Mrs. Alvarez stepped slightly closer beside Emma, protective, without saying a word. The social worker remained calm. "Your daughter reported being left alone for several weeks with insufficient food and no active supervision." Emma's mother laughed suddenly, but there was no humor in it. "This is ridiculous. She's exaggerating." The words hurt even though Emma had expected them, because deep down some part of her had still hoped her parents would finally see the situation differently once they faced it directly. Instead, her mother immediately turned toward appearances and blame. "Do you realize how serious these accusations are?" she demanded angrily. "People online follow our family. This could destroy everything." Emma stared at the floor in disbelief. Even now, her mother's first concern wasn't Emma herself. It was reputation, branding, image. One of the social workers gently placed a folder onto the coffee table. "We've reviewed evidence including statements from neighbors, school staff, and documented conditions inside the home." Then she added carefully, "We also understand there are video recordings." Emma froze completely. She had never told anyone about the videos except the counselor. Her mother's face drained of color instantly. "What videos?" Emma's hands trembled violently now. The counselor had explained earlier that the recordings helped confirm the severity of neglect. But hearing it out loud in front of her parents felt terrifying. One of the workers spoke softly. "Your daughter documented being without adequate food, emotional support, and supervision." For a moment nobody moved. Then Emma's father exhaled sharply and rubbed his forehead. Unlike her mother, his anger suddenly seemed weaker, now replaced by something else: guilt. He looked toward Emma for the first time since entering the house, truly looking at her, instead of through her. He noticed how pale she looked, how small she seemed standing there, how frightened she still was even now. Meanwhile, Emma's mother remained defensive. "She could have called us any time." Emma finally spoke, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "I did." The room went silent again. Tears filled her eyes as weeks of pain rose to the surface all at once. "I told you the food was running out," she whispered. "I told you. I was scared." Her mother opened her mouth, but no words came out this time. Because for the first time, there were witnesses. Adults listening. Evidence that couldn't simply be dismissed as Emma being dramatic. The truth existed outside Emma's own memory now, and that made it impossible to erase. Emma began crying, openly exhausted from holding everything inside for so long. To her surprise, her father slowly sat down and covered his face with both hands. "We thought," he started weakly, before stopping completely. The sentence never finished, because there was nothing left to defend. No luxury vacation photo could hide what had happened anymore. And standing there in the middle of the living room, Emma realized something powerful. Sometimes healing begins the moment the truth is finally seen. Years later, Emma Carter would realize the moment her life truly changed was not when people discovered the truth. It was the moment she finally stopped believing she deserved the pain. In the weeks after Child Protective Services became involved, the Carter family's perfect image unraveled quickly. Sponsorships quietly disappeared. Followers online began questioning old family posts. Friends who once admired Emma's parents suddenly kept their distance. For the first time, the carefully polished version of their lives cracked open enough for reality to show through. But while the adults worried about reputations and consequences, Emma was learning something entirely different: what safety actually felt like. At first, everything felt unfamiliar. Social workers arranged temporary support while the investigation continued, and Emma spent more time with Mrs. Alvarez than anyone else. The older woman never pushed Emma to speak before she was ready. She simply created small routines that slowly made life feel stable again. Warm breakfasts before school, soft music in the kitchen during rainy mornings, quiet conversations where Emma was allowed to feel upset without being called dramatic. Those ordinary moments healed parts of Emma that nobody else had even noticed were broken. Her parents, meanwhile, reacted very differently from each other. Emma's mother remained defensive for a long time. She blamed stress, social media pressure, misunderstandings, anything except the actual choices they had made. Even during supervised family meetings, she kept trying to explain why leaving Emma alone hadn't seemed dangerous at the time. But every explanation only revealed how disconnected she had become from her daughter's emotional reality. Emma no longer argued with her. For the first time in her life, she understood something painful but important. Not every parent is emotionally capable of admitting the harm they caused. Her father changed more slowly but more honestly. At first he barely spoke during meetings, weighed down by visible guilt. Then one afternoon, after weeks of silence, he finally sat across from Emma and quietly said the words she had needed her entire life. "I failed you." Emma looked at him in shock because no adult had ever admitted fault to her before. Tears filled his eyes as he continued. "I kept telling myself you were independent because it was easier than admitting we weren't paying attention." The room remained silent except for Emma's shaky breathing. "You should never have had to survive alone," he whispered. That apology did not magically erase the damage. It didn't undo the fear, hunger, or loneliness Emma had endured. But it mattered. Because accountability, real accountability, sounded completely different from excuses. Therapy became another turning point. At first, Emma hated talking about herself. Years of neglect had taught her that her feelings were burdensome. But little by little she began understanding how deeply abandonment had shaped her thoughts, why she apologized constantly, why asking for help felt shameful, why she believed love had to be earned through silence and obedience. Her therapist once told her gently, children blame themselves, because believing their parents are wrong feels even scarier. That sentence stayed with Emma for months. Slowly she stopped seeing herself as too emotional or too needy. She began seeing the situation clearly for what it had actually been: neglect. And once she accepted that truth, healing finally became possible. Over time, Emma rebuilt her life carefully. She joined activities at school again. She made close friends instead of isolating herself. She laughed more easily, slept without every light on, ate without guilt, and most importantly, she learned to recognize kindness without immediately distrusting it. Her relationship with her father improved gradually through honest effort and consistency. With her mother, things remained complicated. Some wounds healed slowly, others never fully disappeared. But Emma no longer measured her worth through her mother's approval. That alone changed everything. Years later, Emma would keep one thing from that painful time hidden safely inside a small box, the phone containing those late-night videos. Not because she wanted to relive the suffering, but because those recordings reminded her how strong she had truly been. A frightened girl alone in a silent house had found the courage to tell the truth anyway. And in doing so, she saved herself. The most beautiful part of Emma's story was never that her life became perfect afterward. It was that she finally discovered she deserved love that didn't require suffering first. And sometimes, that realization is where real healing begins.